Hilchos Maaser Perek Revi, the laws of the Maaser separation, chapter 4. Yesterday we introduced this concept, Kvios L'Maaser. Kvios L'Maaser means that even once you finish processing all of the work related to finishing produce, the produce is still not obligated to be tithed until one of 6 things happens to it. Shabbos comes in, you take the truma, maybe you pickle something, you toast something, you sell something. But the first of the 6, the one that's not here on the screen, is the most primary one, and that's the one we're going to be dealing with all of today's chapter. And that is bringing it home. The way that Rambam described it yesterday is bringing it into the chutzir, the courtyard, because they used to have, in those days, there was a public lane, which would open up into like a little alleyway, and the alleyway would open up into different chutzirs, courtyards. Each courtyard had at least 2 homes, but maybe more. So once you bring your produce into your courtyard, that's when it becomes nikba, it becomes established for the tithing obligation. And today the Rambam is going to explore this concept in great detail. It says the Rambam halacha aleph, ein ha-tevel nikba le-maasres min ha-Torah. Biblically, tevel is the name for untithed produce. The Rambam writes elsewhere that the word tevel is a conglomeration of 2 words, tav loy, no good. It's no good till you take the tithes. So tevel only becomes established for the tithing obligation ad sheyachnisenu lebeisai, until you bring it into your home. I know I just said the courtyard, but the Rambam says, biblically speaking, it has to actually go into your home. Shenemar, because it says elsewhere, bi'arti hakodesh min habayis, I have gotten rid of all the holy things from my home. This is what a farmer would say. Every couple of years he'd go to the temple to acknowledge the fact that he had taken all the gifts of produce properly. And the way he would open up his statements, he would say, I took out all the holy things from my home. That implies that the obligation only begins once you bring it into the home. Even there, bringing it into the home, you have to bring it in the normal way. You have to bring it in through the gate. Shenemar, because the verse right before it says, V'achlu vish arecha. They have to eat it in your gates. Avalim hichnis tvu asek. Derech gagos v'karpefos. But if you brought your grain through the roof, don't ask me why you do this, but this guy's bringing in his pizza through the roof. But it's just a joke. Point is, you bring your produce through the roof, or through karpef. A karpef we had in the laws of Shabbat at length. Karpef means an unprotected yard. Maybe think of like a junkyard, okay? Adjacent to your home. You would never think to make sure everything is guarded there. If you brought the produce into the home through this yard, pater min ha-truma min ha-maasros. So you're exempt from taking truma and maaser, from tithing this produce. It can simply be brought in and snacked on and eaten, no problem. Halacha beis yera'eli, it seems to me, says the Rambam, she'ein loikin min ha-Torah al achilas ha-tevel. The only time you get lashes biblically if you eat untithed produce is if ad sheyikava bichnisase lebeisai, if it gets established by bringing it into the home, kemoi shebi'arnu mipi hashmua, as we just said, based on the halachic tradition. In other words, this variation of establishing the obligation of tithes is the only one which will hold you accountable biblically for lashes. But if the obligation for tithes is established based on one of the other 6 ways, the ones we saw over here, if you sell it, if you toast it, if you pickle it, if you take truma, or if Shabbos comes in, you only get rabbinic lashes, not biblical lashes. Similarly, if a person eats produce, which he intends to bring to the market, once the processing work is finished, which we said the other day, makes it rabbinically obligated to take tithes. If you eat that, you only get lashes rabbinically, as we explained. Because a person who processes his produce with the sole intention of selling them in the market is only obligated to take tithes rabbinically. Halacha gimel, bayis she'ein boy arba ames al arba ames. If a home doesn't have the size of at least 4 by 4 cubits, 6 by 6 feet. See this guy? The little trailer could actually be used as a home. If that's your home, and it's less than 6 by 6 feet, and you bring in produce there, einay koveya, says the Rambam. It's not considered a home for these laws. It doesn't establish the obligation of tithing. Roofs, if you simply bring your produce onto a roof, it doesn't establish the obligation. Even though the house under the roof is a proper house, halachically, and if you would bring it into the house, you'd be obligated to tithe it. Putting it on the roof, no obligation. Let's say the roof itself didn't even have the size of 4 by 4 amas. For example, the home was on a slant. So there's no area on the roof where you have 4 by 4 cubits of space. So counterintuitively, the roof becomes too small to be considered a separate entity. It doesn't exempt you from taking Maaser. Putting the produce on this roof is like bringing it into the home, and you're obligated to tithe it. Halacha daled hatzrifin. Tzrifin are huts, as in this case. Okay, it has no permanence to it. It's simply built out of growing things. The haburganin. Burganin are guardhouses in a field. They used to have these little structures that the guards would sit in, so they could supervise the field. Ubate hakayitz. Bate hakayitz literally means summer homes, but not like you think, summer home in Miami. There's not a second home. Summer homes, basically what we call today a gazebo. 4 poles with a roof on top. Wintertime, you had to live in a home that had actual walls, right? Because you got to be protected from the elements. In the summer, you can feel comfortable living, so to speak, in this open patio. Shenimtza b'loik salim, which means it has no walls. Or other temporary huts, which people in the vineyards or people in the gardens make for the summer. This is basically, they wanted to be on site as soon as produce became ripe. So they would actually basically move out of their homes and put up a little structure outside the vineyard, outside the gardens, and every day go to check the grain that grew or the produce that grew. Afal pisha darin bahen kol yemei hakayitz, even though these huts might be lived in all summer long. V'yesh bahen rechayim v'tarnagilim, and they even set up millstones and chickens. It's basically a way of making it, established. Think of today, if you bring in your furniture into a summer home, then you know that this is you're kind of setting up shop here. So even if they set up shop, they brought their millstones and their chickens. Einan kaivin l'maaser. The fact is, the construction of these huts is not permanent, and therefore bringing produce into such a structure doesn't make an establishment of tithes on the produce. V'chein sukas hayotzrim hachitzoyna. Similarly, the outer hut of the potter. So I couldn't find the picture of this, but basically potters, they used to have a structure which is basically 2 rooms, one inside the other. The inner room is where they slept, where they lived, and the outer room served as like a storefront, where they would sell their wares. So the outer room of the potter's sukkah, the sukkah sechag bechag, and a regular sukkah on the holiday of Sukkot, einon kaivin. They do not establish your obligation of tithes, shekol elu ein dirasan kva, because all these things are not considered to be permanent dwelling places. Halacha hey hatzrifin v'haburganin, the 2 we mentioned before, the huts and the guardhouses, these 2 on the 2 diagonals, toivlin lebaleim. It's a bit of a caveat. If the owner of the produce is the owner of the hut, and he brings his produce into his hut, it's at least established for tithes for him. He needs to take Maaser. Afal pisha einon toivlin l'chol adam, even if for everybody else, they're not going to make it tevel. They're not going to make it obligated to be tithed. V'chein beis hasefer or beis hamedrash, also a school or a study hall. A school is where young children study. Study halls where older adults study. Toivlin lazeh sheyeshev v'melamed. The teacher, who basically lives there all the time, this school is considered like his home. If he brings his produce into this school or study hall, it becomes tevel for him. He cannot eat it till he tithes it. Because it's like his home. But bringing the produce would not make it tevel for others. Halacha vav, beis hakneses ubeis hamedrash, a shul and a study hall, im yesh bahen beis dira, if they have an apartment, a little place to live. Today, most shuls don't have this, but in olden times it was very common that when you built a shul, you also built like a small living quarters, either for the shamish, for the guy who was in charge of cleaning up, or for guests who came in randomly to have a place to sleep. So if a shul or a beis medrash has a little living space, kaivin, then because of that living space, they become considered like a house, and if the person brings in produce, it becomes obligated to be tithed. V'im lav, if there's no living quarters, ein koivin, they don't establish the obligation. Ha'uryaros. Uryaros are horses' stables. On the left here. V'ha'oitzres shebasados, ha'asuyes limechunas, and storehouses in a field that are meant to store produce. So in the middle of a field, you'd make a little home and bring in harvested produce before you could transfer it back home. Einon koivin. They don't establish the obligation for tithes because nobody lives there. But if they were made with a living purpose, koivin, then they do establish the obligation for tithes. And if you bring the produce in there, you must take Maaser before you eat it. Halacha zayin kashem sha'abayis kaveh leMaaser, kach hechotzer kavas leMaaser. The same way, biblically speaking, a home, bringing it into the actual home, will establish the obligation for tithes. Even if you bring it into the courtyard, it also is obligated to be tithed. The moment they go into the courtyard through the gate, they become established for tithes, even though you didn't bring them into the home. Now, not every courtyard is going to obligate you. What's the type of courtyard which establishes the obligation for tithes? The Rambam gives 3 examples. One is a courtyard which you'd consider any utensil guarded there. If you put your stuff down, you consider it guarded. Or it's a courtyard that's private enough that you aren't embarrassed to eat there. Not today, you walk down the boulevard, people are eating on the street. So maybe this doesn't apply nowadays, but there was a certain sense of social etiquette where you didn't eat if you didn't feel you were in a private space. So if the chotzer is private enough that a person doesn't feel embarrassed to eat, that's a chotzer which establishes the obligation of tithes. Oy chotzer, third example, is a type of courtyard. It's private enough that if a person walks in there who's not belonging to the living space, people will ask him, what are you doing here? Or if you have a courtyard which belongs to 2 tenants or 2 partners, where one person would open it and go in, and the other one would follow. But if he would go out, he would lock it. Since these partners are the only ones who open and close the courtyard, it's considered a private courtyard and it establishes the obligation for tithes. Halacha tes, beis shar shel chotzer, the gateway leading into a courtyard. So this is what I guess you would think of today as like what they call a security booth. You ever drive into a gated community, there's always that booth over there, where he wants to know where you're going. Or if you drive into a parking lot near the airport or any parking lot, they always have those guys that are standing there. So in the same way, going into a courtyard, you would usually have a security booth. And sometimes the security guard would live there in some way or another. So the Rambam says, Beis Shar Shel Chotzer, the gateway, the security booth leading into a courtyard. The Achsadra. Achsadra is an ancient type of Roman structure where there would be 3 walls and a roof. So somewhat permanent, a little more than the gazebo of before. The Hamir Peses and a porch. So it's a little bit of an enclosed area in front of a home. Harehin kechatzer. These 3 have the law of a courtyard. Im haisa kevas kevin. If they're like the courtyard, in that they establish the obligation for tithes, they also establish the obligation for tithes. V'im lav einan kevin. If not, they don't. In other words, if they're private enough that a person would eat there or somebody else would be asked, what are you doing here? So these structures have the same law, and they establish the obligation for tithes. Halacha yod shtei chatzeres zu lifnei mizu. If you have 2 courtyards, one within the other, shtei and kayvais, they both establish the obligation for tithes. Sukkah sayitzrim, the sukkah of the potters, which we spoke about before, zu lifnei mizu, where there's one inside the other, hapnimis kayvas va'achitzena ina kayvas. The inner one establishes the obligation for tithes, but not the outer one. And the commentators wonder why that Rambam repeats it right here. We just said it before. Va'achanus kayvas kebayis. A store is establishing like a home, because the store owners would spend a lot of time in their store. Like today, people spend time in the office. People would almost live in their store. Halacha Yud Aleph, hamoilich pereisa mimakim lamakim. If a person is transferring produce from place to place, afal pishu nichnas b'hen lebatim v'lachatzeres baderech, even though on the way, he definitely enters many homes or many courtyards, but they're not his final destination. Loy nikbu, the obligation to establish tithes, is not established. Ella oichel ara, he can keep snacking ad shiyagia lamakim sho soif megamaser, until he reaches the place which is the end of his goal. V'chein b'chazara, so too if he goes back, as the commentators explain, if he changes his mind in the middle and he wants to head back home, so now home becomes the final destination, and any other homes that he stops in on the way don't establish the obligation for tithes. Halacha Yud Beis haroichlin. Roichlin are peddlers. They're always carrying tons of stuff. Hamachazirin ba'ayare. So they're making their rounds in the cities. Shehei nichnasin mechatzer lechatzer, where they also go in from courtyard to courtyard. Oichlin arai ad shemagin labayis shalonin bay. They can eat snacking until they reach the home where they spend the night. Here it's a bit more strict, because a peddler doesn't have a final destination. He just wants to sell his wares. So wherever he spends the night becomes the permanent place for him, and therefore, as soon as you go into the place where you're spending the night, you have to tithe your produce. Halacha Yud Gimel hamevi te'eni min hasadeh la'achlan b'chatzer haptura min ha'maisers. A person is transferring figs from his field to eat them in a courtyard which would be exempt from tithing, so a not private courtyard. Shachach v'hichnisan l'seich beisai, and then while he's on the way, he forgets and brings them into his home, which should obligate them. But because he did it inadvertently, you're allowed to take them back out and keep snacking on them. So too, if you forgot and put them onto your roof, you can keep on eating them as a snack on the roof. Or some have the word liyabsham. We're going to go with the word la'achlan. If you brought them up to eat them on your roof, and you forgot and you brought them into your friend's courtyard, fascinatingly, they make you establish the obligation to give tithes. And he cannot eat until he takes Maaser. And there's a bit of a debate in the commentaries, who cannot eat? Some say it's the owner of the courtyard that cannot eat, because the owner of the produce, if he forgot and brought it into his own home and it's not established, certainly if he brought it into someone else's home. But others say no, we're even talking about the owner of the produce, and there's a special difference between bringing it into your friend's home, bringing it into your home. If you bring it into your home as a mistake, you're certainly making a mistake, because you didn't mean to, you wanted to bring it into your chutzner. But if you're bringing it into a friend's home, it could be you consciously changed your mind and wanted to bring it into his chutzner, and therefore we're going to be more stringent with you. Yud Dalet. Chutzner shehi nederes. If a courtyard is plowed, harehi kegina, it becomes like a garden. It's no longer considered to be a living space, and you can eat it there, eat your produce there as a snack. As long as most of it was plowed. Once you plant most of it, it's transferred back into a regular quarter, and you cannot eat there as a snack. Or if you planted trees in most of it. If you planted for the beauty of the courtyard, since it's been plowed, since you didn't plant there for living quarters, you planted there just for beauty, you can keep eating snacks from those trees. Here you have a fig tree in a courtyard. So the way you snack on it is you eat one fig at a time, and you're exempt from tithing. For the moment you collect a bunch of figs together, now you have to take Maaser before you eat them. When do we say this? If you're standing on the ground. You're on the ground picking figs from the tree. But if you ascended, you climbed the tree, you're allowed to fill up your bosom and eat multiple figs there. Because only the floor of the courtyard establishes the obligation for tithes, not the airspace. If you're on a tree, you're in the airspace, not on the floor. Halacha Tezayin. Here we have a tree in a courtyard, leaning over to the garden. You can stand outside in the garden and eat off of the tree as you would if a regular tree was in the garden. Watch the switch. Boom. The tree is now outside in the garden, leaning into the chatzer. We follow the leaves. It's like it's planted in the chatzer. You can only eat there one at a time. Halacha Yud Zayin gefen shenetua bechatzer. If you have a vine, here is my picture of the vine. The vine planted in the courtyard. Lo yitelas kala eshkel v'yochal. Snacking means that you cannot take off the whole cluster at once and eat it. You have to pick off literally one grape at a time. That's called snacking. Same thing if it's a pomegranate. You cannot take the entire pomegranate off of a tree. It's pretty hard to do, but you have to kind of cut open the pomegranate while it's on the tree, and then eat the seeds as they are on the tree, snacking seed at a time. Same thing on a watermelon. You have it growing in the ground. You bend it over to the ground, on the ground, eat it on the ground. If you were eating a cluster of grapes in the garden where it's okay to eat clusters, and then you entered a courtyard where it's now not okay, even though you left the courtyard afterwards, once you walked in, you become established, you cannot finish the cluster till you take Maaser. Halacha Yudches, kusbar, hazrua b'chatzer, this is a coriander field. If you have coriander planted in a courtyard, the way to snack it is you rip off a leaf at a time and you eat it. Once you collect a bunch of leaves together, chayav la'aser, you must take Maaser before you keep eating it. And the same thing applies in all similar situations. Every type of plant, snacking means you take one at a time and no collecting is allowed.